My name is Sophia Williams, and 3 days before my wedding, I learned that love stories don't always get destroyed by strangers. Sometimes it's the family you're about to marry into who sharpen the knives. I thought I was walking into a life built on love, respect, and a future Ethan and I had dreamed together. Instead, I walked into a trap dressed up in polished manners, porcelain cups, and the blue leather folder. I remember the exact moment it began. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days before the big day. The flowers had been ordered, the dress tailored, the guest list finalized. I was exhausted but excited, balancing the 100 details every bride juggles in the final stretch. Then I received Victoria Blackwood's invitation. "Tea at the estate, just the two of us," she said on the phone, her voice dripping with sweetness that felt almost unnatural. She framed it as a chance for mother-in-law and daughter-in-law to share a quiet moment before the chaos of the wedding weekend. I wanted to believe it. After months of subtle criticism and polite distance, maybe this was her attempt to bridge the gap. But when I pulled my Audi into the immaculate circular driveway of the Blackwood estate, the first red flag appeared. Richard's Mercedes was already parked outside. He wasn't supposed to be part of this tea. Still, I smoothed my dress, told myself not to overthink, and followed the housekeeper into the formal sitting room. Victoria sat primly on one end of the sofa, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Richard occupied the armchair opposite, his power suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. Between them sat a tray of untouched tea and cookies, like props on a stage set. "Sophia, dear," Victoria greeted me, her smile tight. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please sit." I obeyed, though my stomach clenched. This wasn't tea. This was business. Richard wasted no time. He reached for the leather folder at his side, pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, and slid it across the coffee table. "This is the family's prenuptial agreement. We'll need your signature by 9 a.m. tomorrow." I stared at the document. The word prenup echoed in my mind like a gunshot. Ethan and I had never discussed this. He had never mentioned that his family expected one. "I don't understand," I said carefully. "Why am I only seeing this now?" Victoria's tone was smooth as glass. "Because now is the right time, dear. We didn't want to trouble you earlier. It's just a formality. Every marriage in our family begins this way." I picked up the document, flipping through the dense legal text, but I didn't need to read far. My background in computer science and running a startup had taught me to recognize imbalance in contracts, and this was pure imbalance. It left me nothing. No property, no marital assets, not even clear protection of my intellectual property. In the event of divorce, everything reverted to Ethan, regardless of what I contributed. Even my company's future innovations could, under certain clauses, fall under their family protection. "This seems one-sided," I said, keeping my voice neutral, though my heart was racing. Richard leaned back, lacing his fingers together. "It's standard for protecting family wealth. We've been doing this for generations." "And my assets?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, measured. Victoria gave a soft laugh, polite but cutting. "Darling, your little software venture is charming, but compared to the Blackwood holdings, it's not really significant enough to be a concern." Heat rose in my chest, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I placed the document neatly back on the table. "I'll need to have my own lawyer review this before I sign anything." Richard's expression hardened. "There's no need for outside involvement. Our family attorney is one of the best in Chicago. This is standard. All we need is your signature by 9 a.m. tomorrow." I swallowed, choosing my words carefully. "So if I don't sign by tomorrow morning?" Victoria's smile sharpened. "Then unfortunately the wedding cannot proceed. Sign it, or the wedding is off." There it was. Not a request, not even a negotiation. An ultimatum. I rose slowly, gathering the document. "I'll discuss this with Ethan." "Ethan understands," Victoria said smoothly. "He knows his duty to the family. If you truly love him, you will understand too." The tea set sat untouched between us, a silent reminder of the civility they pretended to extend while cornering me like a suspect in an interrogation room. I walked out of that mansion with their smug confidence burning in my ears. As I drove away, Victoria's voice drifted from the open window, just audible enough. She'll sign. Where else would she find a match like Ethan? Richard's low chuckle followed, slicing through me like a blade. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were shaking on the wheel. My phone buzzed with Ethan's name flashing again and again, but I let it ring. I couldn't hear his voice yet, not until I decided whether I could still believe it. Inside, I dropped the prenup on my coffee table like it was contaminated. I paced, my mind replaying every subtle insult, every glance Victoria had given me over the past 2 years. My car called practical, my dress called budget-friendly, my entire existence treated as an inconvenient detail to be tolerated for Ethan's sake. And now this. Finally, I called Jenna, my best friend. The moment I explained, she exploded. They did what? Sophia, that's manipulative beyond belief. 3 days before your wedding? They think I have nothing, I whispered. They don't know who they're dealing with, Jenna shot back. Call Harold, first thing. You're not signing that garbage. I hung up feeling steadier. Jenna was right. I wasn't powerless. They thought I was marrying up, but I had no idea I was already standing on my own mountain. That night, when I finally answered Ethan's call, his voice was tight with worry. Sophia, Mom said you left upset. What happened? I closed my eyes. What happened is that your parents ambushed me with the prenup and told me I either signed by 9 a.m. or the wedding is off. They also said you knew. Silence. Long, telling silence. Ethan, I pushed. Did you know? He sighed. Yes, I knew they expected a prenup, but I just didn't know they'd spring it on you like that. I planned to bring it up myself. You planned to let them corner me? I didn't want to upset you. His voice cracked with frustration. It's tradition, Sophia. Every marriage in my family has one. It's not personal. Tradition, that word again, used to justify control, inequality, power plays. I hung up before tears could break through my voice. But as I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the blue folder, my sadness hardened into resolve. They wanted a bride they could bully. What they had instead was a woman with 9 million reasons to say no. The next morning, I was already awake before the sun, the blue prenup folder still sitting on my coffee table like a curse. And as I watched the city outside my window shift from darkness into gray light, I felt something shift inside me too. A decision crystallizing so sharp it almost hurt. So I dialed Harold's number, my grandfather's lawyer, and the only man I trusted to strip this charade down to its bones. And when he answered with his steady voice, I said only 2 words, urgent meeting. And by 7 a.m., we were seated in my downtown office, him and his perfectly pressed suit with his leather briefcase older than me in a charcoal outfit I chose deliberately to project strength rather than fear. And when I slid the prenup across the table and he began to read in silence, his frown deepened with every page until finally he set it down, removed his glasses, and said flatly that this was one of the most predatory documents he had seen in decades, designed not to protect wealth, but to erase me entirely. And I felt a strange calm because that was exactly the clarity I needed. So we began rewriting line by line, building a new agreement that shielded not only Ethan's family legacy, but my own, that drew clear boundaries around my intellectual property, my company, my future contributions. And as Harold drafted, I opened the folder that until now I had kept closed from everyone except him, the full accounting of my net worth. $7.5 million grown from my grandfather's investments and another $1.5 million from the valuation of my tech company, a total of $9 million that the Blackwoods had never imagined. And Harold's eyes lit with a sharp kind of satisfaction as he scanned the numbers, murmuring that this revelation would change the entire battlefield. And I nodded because that was exactly the point. They thought I was powerless, that I came begging for scraps. But in reality, I had been choosing silence, and now silence had become my sharpest weapon. So, by 10 a.m., we had finished the draft. Balanced, fair, impossible to twist against me, and Harold closed his pad with finality and said, "Now comes the strategy, Sophia. How and when we reveal the truth." And I already knew. I would face Ethan first, because whatever else was true, I needed to see where he stood when confronted with the reality that I was not the weak outsider his parents believed, but an equal. And only then would we go together to the Blackwoods, not as supplicant and heir, but as two people who loved each other and demanded respect. And as Harold left with his briefcase and a plan in his eyes, I sent Ethan a simple message. Lunch, 1 o'clock, just us. Because by then, the choice would be his, and the future of this wedding would no longer belong to his parents' tradition, but to the truth we were about to lay bare. At 1 o'clock, I walked into Carlucci's, the Italian restaurant where Ethan and I had celebrated our first anniversary, a place filled with memories of laughter and wine and soft candlelight. But today it felt like an arena where the fate of our future would be decided. And when I spotted him already waiting at the table tucked in the corner, his face looked different, tense, tired, as if he had not slept all night. And when he stood to greet me, his eyes were full of worry and guilt. "Sophia, thank God you came," he said, reaching for my hand, but I kept mine folded in my lap because I needed truth before comfort. And I told him straight, "Your parents ambushed me with a prenup. They told me if I don't sign by this morning, the wedding is off, and they said you knew." And the silence that followed spoke louder than any words, until he finally said, "Yes, I knew they expected one, but I didn't know they'd force it on you like that." And my chest tightened, because whether he knew the details or not, he had known enough to prepare me, to trust me, and he had not. So I looked him in the eye and asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" And he rubbed his face with both hands, saying, "I thought it would upset you. I thought it was easier this way." And I almost laughed bitterly because easier for who? Certainly not for me. And I said, "Ethan, do you even know what was in that document? Do you know they tried to write it so that even my company, my intellectual property, could be claimed by your family?" And he froze, stammered something about it being just a family template, nothing serious. But I pulled the folded contract from my bag and tapped the clause with my finger. "Read it, Section 4, Paragraph 3. And as his eyes scanned the words, I watched the color drain from his face. He whispered, "This isn't right. I didn't know." And for the first time, I saw not the confident attorney who argued in courtrooms, but a man caught between the love of his life and the gravitational pull of his family's empire. And I told him calmly, "This is not about tradition, Ethan. This is about control, about underestimating me, about assuming I have nothing and therefore deserve nothing." And he shook his head, saying, "I love you, Sophia. That's all that matters. We can fix this." But love without respect is fragile, and I needed him to understand that. So I reached into my bag again and slid another folder across the table, this one filled with my financial statements, my inheritance, my company valuation, every detail of my net worth. And I said quietly, "Your parents think I'm marrying up, but the truth is I'm worth $9 million on my own." And he stared at the papers as if they were written in another language, flipping page after page, whispering, "9 million? Why didn't you tell me?" And I answered, "Because I wanted to know if you loved me for me, not my bank account. Because I watched how people treated you differently when they knew your last name, and I refused to live like that." And for a long moment, he said nothing, just pressed his hand over his mouth, and finally he whispered, "My God, they've been calling you a gold digger when in fact you're wealthier than half our family." And something in his voice cracked, not with anger at me, but with shame at them. And I said, "Ethan, this is the truth. I want a marriage of equals. I want us to build together, but I will not marry into a family that thinks they can dictate my worth." And I pulled out the second document, the prenup Harold and I had drafted that morning, balanced, protective of both sides, and I slid it toward him saying, "This is what I will sign, nothing else."
And he read through it quickly, understanding the fairness, nodding slowly, and finally he looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "I choose you, Sophia, not them, not tradition, not coercion, just you." And in that moment, I felt something loosen in my chest, the first hint of trust returning. But I told him, "This is only the beginning. Tonight we face your parents together. We show them the truth. We make them see us as equals or not at all." And Ethan squeezed my hand across the table, his grip firm, his eyes steady for the first time in days. And he said, "Then tonight they will finally see who you really are, and maybe who I am too." And as we left the restaurant hand in hand, I knew the real battle was still ahead, but at least for the first time we were walking toward it together, side by side, as partners.
At 6 o'clock sharp, Ethan and I walked into Lakeview Restaurant's private dining room, hand in hand, the mahogany table gleaming under the chandelier and the wide windows framing Lake Michigan, glittering in the evening sun. And though the view was beautiful, the air was thick with tension because we both knew this would not be a family dinner, but a battlefield where love and power collided. And that's predicted. Richard and Victoria arrived late, 17 minutes past the hour. Victoria sweeping in wearing burgundy silk and diamonds like armor, while Richard exuded authority in his charcoal suit. And Victoria air-kissed Ethan as if I were invisible, before remarking, "What a charming venue this is for a simple signature." But I remained calm and gestured to the seats across from us. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." And something in my tone must have warned her because she narrowed her eyes as she arranged herself with practiced grace, while Richard wasted no time saying, "I trust you have come to a sensible decision, Sophia, though 9 o'clock has long passed." And Ethan spoke before I could, his voice steady and firm. "We reviewed your prenup and found it unacceptable." And Richard's brows shot up. "Unacceptable? This is the standard Blackwood agreement. Your siblings signed identical ones." But Ethan leaned forward. "Those were not the same circumstances. Power dynamics matter, and this was coercion." And Victoria scoffed. "Power dynamics, Ethan, really? This is not sociology class. This is protecting family wealth." But then I placed my leather portfolio on the table and opened it, sliding across two documents. One, the new prenup Harold and I had drafted. The other, my financial statements. And I said clearly, "We agree protection is necessary, which is why I have prepared an alternative agreement that protects both parties equally. And before you dismiss it, perhaps you should understand that I am not who you think I am. My net worth is $9 million, 7.5 from my grandfather's investments, and 1.5 from my company's valuation." And for the first time in 2 years of knowing them, silence filled the room. Victoria's painted smile freezing mid-curve, Richard's lawyer instincts making him reach for the papers, scanning them with a frown that deepened into something between disbelief and reluctant respect. And Victoria finally found her voice, sputtering, "That's impossible. You drive an old Audi. Your parents are teachers." And I replied evenly, "I value substance over show, just as your ancestor who built this family fortune once did." And Ethan's hand tightened on mine as if he had never been prouder. And Richard cleared his throat, saying, "These appear legitimate, though unusual." And I countered, "Unusual perhaps, but fair, unlike the one you presented." And Ethan spoke firmly, "This is the agreement we will sign, nothing less. And if that means the wedding is off, then so be it." And I had never loved him more in that moment, watching him stand against the manipulation that had ruled his life. But Richard was not ready to surrender so easily. He muttered, "We will need time to review this." And I said, "You gave me less than 24 hours to sign your one-sided version. You have until tomorrow afternoon to respond to ours." And Victoria bristled, "Hardly enough time for proper counsel." But I met her eyes and said, "It was enough time for me, wasn't it?" And Richard placed a calming hand on her arm, realizing the shift in leverage. "Very well," he said, businessman to businessman. "We will review with our attorneys by 3 p.m. tomorrow, and any changes must preserve the balance." And Ethan nodded. "Exactly. This is not a negotiation back to one-sided terms." And Victoria finally looked at me differently. Her usual condescension cracked, and she said quietly, "Perhaps I misjudged you, Sophia, though I still find it strange you concealed this wealth." And I answered, "Perhaps we all could have been more transparent, but moving forward, I expect respect."
And Richard surprised me by extending his hand across the table, saying, "You've proven yourself formidable, Sophia. Perhaps the Blackwood family will benefit from perspectives we did not anticipate." And I accepted his handshake, feeling the weight of a temporary truce, while Victoria remained silent, but no longer smirking. And when they left, Ethan pulled me close, whispering, "You were magnificent." And I whispered back, "We were magnificent." Because for the first time, it felt true. We had stood as equals, side by side. And as we stepped out into the night air, I knew the real war was far from over. But the first battle had been won, and the smug grins on their faces had finally been wiped clean.
The next morning, I woke before dawn again, unable to shake the heaviness of what was waiting at 3 p.m., and though Ethan held me close, whispering that we had done the right thing, that we had already set the terms, my mind kept circling back to Victoria's eyes, narrowing with calculation, to Richard's lawyerly silence as he read Harold's draft, and I knew they would not let this pass quietly. So by noon, I was already at my office with Harold, who reviewed once more every clause of our prenup, reminding me to remain steady no matter what theatrics they deployed. And at 2:45 sharp, we arrived at Lakeview Restaurant's private room again. But this time, the Blackwoods did not come alone. Their family attorney, a man named Silverman, walked in with them, a slick figure with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue. And from the first handshake, I could feel his attempt to intimidate, his grip deliberately crushing as he smirked, saying, "Well, Miss Williams, quite the surprise you've given us." And I matched his stare, replying only, "Clarity is rarely a surprise to those who seek fairness." And we all sat, the documents spread out like weapons on the polished wood. Richard opening with the kind of calm that hides steel. "We have reviewed your counterproposal, and while it contains many fair points, there are clauses that are unworkable for our family's interests." And before I could speak, Harold leaned forward, his voice clipped, "Then propose specific changes, but be warned, any attempt to revert to one-sided terms will be rejected outright." And Silverman jumped in, smooth as oil, suggesting revisions that stripped my intellectual property protections, watering them down into vague promises, and Harold shut him down with precise legal language, reminding him that my company predated the marriage and would remain wholly mine. And the volley continued, clause by clause, with Richard pressing, Victoria sighing dramatically about family trust and tradition, Silverman circling like a vulture, and Harold and I refusing to budge from the balanced structure. And when Silverman finally snapped that perhaps Miss Williams's assets were overstated, that independent valuation might be required, I pulled out the certified documents, investment statements, and third-party valuations, all notarized, sliding them across the table with steady hands, saying, "These numbers have been verified by top firms. Dismiss them if you wish, but the truth remains." And the look on Richard's face told me he knew there was no hole to exploit, no weakness to undermine. And Ethan chose that moment to speak, his voice firm, with the confidence I had never seen before. "This is the agreement Sophia and I will sign, and if you cannot accept that, then there will be no wedding." And Victoria gasped, as if struck, her eyes widening, not at me, but at her son, because for the first time, he was choosing against her manipulation. And Richard's lips tightened. Silverman shuffled his papers, and Harold closed his briefcase with a decisive snap, as if to say, the matter was settled. And at exactly 3 o'clock, Richard finally exhaled and said, "Very well, we will proceed with this agreement," though his tone carried the weight of a man conceding defeat. And Victoria sat frozen, the diamonds at her ears catching light like shards of ice, and I met her gaze and said softly, "This was never about money. It was about respect. And now that respect has been established." And she said nothing, only looked away. And in that silence, I felt the shift, the tectonic realignment of power that would define the rest of our lives. The Blackwoods had tried to corner me, but instead they had been forced to acknowledge me, not as a girl desperate to marry into their empire, but as a woman who brought her own. And as Ethan and I walked out together into the crisp Chicago air, prenup signed in balanced terms, I realized the battle had not broken us. It had welded us into something stronger, a partnership forged in fire, ready for whatever storms the future might bring. 2 days later, I stood in the bridal suite of the Drake Hotel, the sleek modern gown I had chosen hugging my frame like armor and silk all at once. And as my mother adjusted the train with trembling hands and Jenna dabbed at her eyes, pretending not to cry, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, and for the first time in months, I saw not the girl nervously navigating Blackwood dinners, but the woman who had stood her ground, revealed her truth, and forced a family built on arrogance to acknowledge her worth. And that woman smiled back at me with steady eyes, no longer intimidated, no longer hiding. And when the soft knock came, and Victoria entered in the pale blue dress instead of her usual intimidating jewel tones, carrying a small velvet box in her hand, my pulse jumped, because I had no idea what battle or barb she might bring. But she surprised me with gentleness, saying, "You make a beautiful bride, Sophia." And then she opened the box to reveal antique sapphire earrings, explaining they belonged to Ethan's great-grandmother, who had once been dismissed as unworthy until she saved the family business during the Depression. And as she helped me fasten them to my ears, her hands trembled almost imperceptibly, and she whispered, "I owe you an apology, not the kind I gave at the restaurant, but a real one, because I judged you without knowing you. I underestimated you, and you deserved better." And though it wasn't perfect, it was enough. A crack in the armor, a bridge being built. And when she left the room, I touched the earrings and felt their weight like a legacy passed, not of money, but of resilience, of women who carved their place in a world that tried to shut them out. And minutes later, my father appeared to walk me down the aisle, his eyes misting as he whispered, "My brilliant girl, ready to start this new chapter?" And I was more than ready, because as the doors opened and music swelled and I stepped into the room full of 200 guests, I saw Ethan at the altar, his eyes shining not with nerves, but with unwavering love. And all the fights, the documents, the ultimatums dissolved in that gaze, and each step carried me closer not just to him, but to the future we had fought for. And as we exchanged vows, my voice did not shake. I promised to stand beside him as an equal, to build a life of truth and resilience. And he promised the same, his words choked with emotion. And when the officiant declared us husband and wife, there were tears in Richard's eyes, though he quickly looked away, and Victoria dabbed delicately at her cheek with the lace handkerchief. And at the reception, subtle changes emerged. Richard introduced me to partners and judges, not as Ethan's bride, but as Sophia Williams, entrepreneur, founder of EduTech Solutions. Victoria seated me at her right hand beside one of her most influential friends, asking about my company with something that sounded almost like genuine curiosity. And Ethan leaned close during our first dance, whispering, "Amazing what 9 million does for social standing." And I whispered back, "It's not the money, it's the respect." And he smiled, saying, "Maybe both, but either way, I've never been prouder to call you my wife." And as we spun across the floor under chandeliers and applause, I realized the battle had changed not just how they saw me, but how I saw myself. No longer hiding, no longer apologizing, but stepping fully into the life I had built. And as the night stretched into laughter and toast and the clinking of glasses, I carried with me the quiet certainty that this marriage had been forged in fire and would stand because it had begun not with compromise to coercion, but with the courage to say no, to demand equal ground, and to walk into the future with my head high. Our honeymoon in the Greek islands felt like stepping into another world, the sun bouncing off whitewashed walls and the sea stretching endless and blue. And for the first time in weeks, there were no documents, no ultimatums, no calculated stares across polished mahogany tables. Only Ethan and me walking hand in hand through winding cobblestone alleys, laughing over too sweet baklava and watching the sky turn gold over Santorini's cliffs. And in that quiet freedom, we began to unravel the knots left by the Blackwood ordeal. Late at night on the balcony of our villa, with the waves whispering below, Ethan admitted he had never felt so torn, that for years he had balanced love for his parents with the constant pressure of their expectations, but that the prenup ambush had made him see clearly that love without respect was hollow. And he said, "Sophia, when I watched you slide those financial statements across the table, I felt two things at once: shame at my family for treating you so poorly, and awe at your strength." And I squeezed his hand and told him the truth, that I had hidden my wealth, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted to build something real without the distortion of dollar signs. And he nodded, saying, "I understand now, and I'll never forgive myself for letting them blindside you. But I promise you this, Sophia, never again.
Our marriage will never be defined by their conditions. And in those quiet words, I believed him, because the man who had once hesitated now looked at me with clarity. And as we swam in the Aegean, explored ruins and roads, and got lost in tiny villages where no one knew the name Blackwood, I felt layers of tension peel away until all that was left was the foundation of what we had always been. Two people who loved hiking, debate, food too spicy for our own good, and each other. And one night over dinner by the sea, Ethan said, "I think we need to set boundaries now before the rhythm of their influence creeps back. Sunday dinners once a month, not weekly, no financial entanglements, no veto power over our decisions." And I agreed without hesitation because we both knew that marriage was not just about us, but about managing the gravitational pull of powerful families. And we sketched out together how we would respond when Victoria tried to guilt us or when Richard cloaked control in legalese. And as we laughed over mock dialogues, me politely refusing, Ethan standing firm, we realized we were not just partners in love, but strategists in life. And that realization made the air feel lighter, the future less daunting. And on our last night in Greece, as we watched lanterns rise into the dark sky, Ethan pulled me close and whispered, "I don't care if the world sees you as 9 million or 90. To me, you're the woman who made me braver than I ever thought I could be." And I whispered back that to him, he was the man who chose us over legacy. And in that moment, I knew that whatever storms the Blackwoods might try to send our way, we had already weathered the worst and come out not weaker, but stronger. Two voices, one partnership, ready to write the rest of our story together. When we returned to Chicago, the honeymoon glow still clung to us, but almost immediately the rhythm of Blackwood influence began testing the boundaries we had promised to set. The first sign came in the form of an engraved invitation delivered by courier to our condo, Victoria's handwriting on the enclosed note, insisting that as tradition dictated, Ethan and I attend Sunday dinners weekly at the Lake Forest estate. And instead of bristling, I smiled because we had already prepared for this. Ethan called her that evening, his voice calm but firm, explaining that once a month was the limit we would accept. There was a long silence on the line before Victoria sighed theatrically and said, "If that's what you insist, though you must know Richard will be disappointed." But when Sunday came and we attended the dinner, it was clear the dynamic had shifted. The long table set with crystal and silver as always, but Richard greeted me differently, introducing me to his partners as Sophia Williams, founder of EduTech Solutions, rather than Ethan's fiancé. And when one of them asked about our company's latest contract with the Chicago public school system, Richard actually leaned in and said, "She's modest, but it's a groundbreaking deal." And Victoria, though still cool, no longer dismissed me with subtle barbs, but asked pointed questions about my strategies, her tone a mixture of curiosity and reluctance, as if testing how much she might learn. And I answered evenly, never defensive, never deferential, because respect once claimed must be held steady. And after dinner, when she hinted that perhaps Ethan and I might consider relocating closer to the family estate for convenience, I simply smiled and said, "Our home downtown suits us perfectly." And Ethan reinforced it without hesitation. And I saw a flicker of frustration in her eyes at being denied, but also a grudging recognition that this was no longer a daughter-in-law she could manage, but a woman standing on equal ground. And over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Subtle pushes from Victoria, invitations to events scheduled without consulting us, suggestions that I might use my company's resources to support certain Blackwood clients. And each time I stood firm, polite but immovable, and Ethan stood with me. And slowly the texture of our interactions changed, less adversarial, more careful, because they had realized the old levers of control no longer worked. And Richard, in particular, seemed to appreciate this new balance. One evening, he asked me to review proposals for a technology upgrade at the family law firm, and when I gave direct, practical recommendations, he listened intently, even implementing some, later sending me a handwritten note of thanks, a gesture that carried more weight than grand speeches. And Victoria, though slower to shift, began showing me artifacts of the family history, portraits, stories of women who had once been outsiders and eventually shaped the Blackwood legacy, perhaps unconsciously acknowledging me as part of that lineage. And through it all, Ethan and I built our own rhythm. Financial decisions made jointly, our condo decorated with touches from both our lives, dinners cooked together where laughter replaced legal jargon. And one night, as we walked along the river, I realized the real victory was not the signed prenup or the grudging respect of his parents, but the fact that we had forged a partnership that held steady against pressure. And in that steady current, we were writing a new Blackwood chapter, where love and equality mattered more than pedigree or manipulation. And though I knew Victoria would never completely relinquish her instinct to control, and Richard would always measure worth in terms of legacy, I also knew that I had carved a place at the table, not by force alone, but by refusing to shrink, by choosing every day to stand tall. And in that knowledge, I found a peace deeper than triumph, a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of a story we would continue to write together on our own terms. A few months after the wedding, I launched the Vivian Foundation, named quietly in honor of my grandfather, whose disciplined investing had built the seed of my fortune, and whose belief in education had shaped every decision I ever made. The foundation focused on providing technology and mentorship for underprivileged students, giving them not just computers, but pathways to futures that once seemed unreachable. And as the press release went out and local media covered the story, the Blackwoods realized that the woman they once saw as a charity case was making headlines for philanthropy that aligned with values deeper than legacy wealth. Richard surprised me by calling to congratulate me, not as a formality, but with genuine interest, asking how the law firm might support the initiative pro bono. And for the first time, his tone carried not calculation, but respect. While Victoria attended the inaugural gala in a gown understated for her, and though she still held herself with regal distance, I caught her watching me as I spoke on stage, describing the mission to an audience of donors and students. And for a fleeting moment, her expression softened, almost maternal, as if recognizing that I was not simply Ethan's wife, but a woman commanding a room on my own terms. And after the applause, she even approached me with a measured smile, saying, "Your words moved people, Sophia, perhaps more than the fine wine or music." And I knew it was her way of conceding that influence did not always wear the Blackwood crest. And Ethan beamed through it all, proud not just as a husband, but as a partner who had chosen someone who could stand on her own. And in quiet moments after the gala, as we walked home, he whispered, "This is why I love you, not just because you challenge me, but because you challenge the world." And I held his hand tighter, realizing that love built on equal strength was a fortress no tradition could breach. But success brought new waves, too. Journalists eager to dig into my background, whispers among society circles that perhaps the Blackwoods had underestimated me. And while some painted me as the upstart who outmaneuvered her in-laws, others admired the balance we had created, and I chose not to chase approval or battle rumors, but to keep building. Each scholarship awarded, each child mentored, reinforcing the truth louder than gossip ever could. And though Victoria still tested boundaries, she also began inviting me to sit beside her at charity luncheons, not as a guest, but as a co-host. A subtle signal to the society pages that I was part of the family, not by concession, but by undeniable presence. And one afternoon, after a particularly warm event, she leaned close and said, "I see now that Ethan didn't just marry well, he chose wisely." And though her pride would never allow the word apology, I heard it beneath the layers of her voice. And I answered with a smile, because forgiveness was not weakness, but power reclaimed. And Richard, too, shifted, bringing me into business conversations where my perspective on technology and strategy added value. and once even admitting over brandy that perhaps he had underestimated what a teacher's daughter could bring to the Blackwood table. And in that moment, I realized the war had ended, not with surrender, but with transformation. They had not broken me, I had reshaped them. And as I stood in the quiet of my office later that night, surrounded by photos of smiling scholarship students, I felt something settle inside me. The certainty that this life was mine to design, not theirs to dictate, and that the story of Sophia Williams was no longer about proving worth, but about living it every day with Ethan by my side and a future wide open before us.
6 months after the storm that nearly broke us, I found myself standing on the balcony of our new home. The city lights of Chicago glowing beneath a velvet sky. Ethan inside working on case notes. Laughter from our last dinner with friends still echoing in my ears. And I realized how far we had come from the night I drove home with tears blurring my vision and a prenup heavy on the passenger seat. Back then, I had felt cornered, underestimated, defined by someone else's perception. Now I stood here not just as Ethan's wife, but as Sophia Williams Blackwood, equal partner, entrepreneur, philanthropist, daughter who had honored her grandfather's legacy and built her own. And as I breathed in the cold air, I thought about Richard, who now asked my advice without hesitation, about Victoria, who still bristled sometimes but had begun sharing family heirlooms and stories as if weaving me into the tapestry, about Ethan, who had chosen to stand with me even when it meant breaking patterns he had lived under his whole life. And I understood that real transformation rarely arrives with thunder or victory speeches, but with 1,000 steady refusals to be less than what you are, 1,000 small stands, until one day you look around and see respect where there was once only dismissal, love where there was once only calculation, and family redefined not by blood or legacy, but by the daily decision to show up, to honor, to respect, to build together. And if someone had told me a year ago that my greatest test would come not in boardrooms or funding rounds, but in a living room with crystal teacups and two parents convinced of their own superiority, I might have laughed. Yet it was exactly that test that forced me to reveal myself fully, no longer hiding behind modest facades, but embracing the truth that strength and softness can coexist, that love is only real when it stands on equal ground. And as I turned back inside to see Ethan looking up at me with that same warmth that first caught me at a charity gala, I knew that whatever challenges came next, we were ready. Not because money shielded us, not because names impressed anyone, but because we had chosen each other as equals and demanded that the world respect it. So to anyone listening who has ever been underestimated, who has been told to be grateful for crumbs while hiding their own feast, I say this: do not let anyone else write your story. Do not let intimidation disguise itself as tradition. Reveal your worth when the moment calls for it, and never be afraid to stand firm, even if your voice shakes, because respect, once claimed, changes everything. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who doubted you? Have you ever revealed your true strength and watched their smug certainty crumble? I would love to hear your story in the comments. And if this journey resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to join me for more tales of transformation, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be less than who you are. Because in the end, wealth fades, names fade, but dignity and love built on truth endure forever.